keeps the blood flowing through your brain.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, the one that he was talking about, he was saying he does 1 hour of exercise every day and no more. Because he says you can actually get too much.
You overdo it.
But he does religiously do 1 hour of exercise every day.
I do 45 minutes.
There was some politician, I forget who it was, a number of years ago, that I remember they kind of raked over the coals because they mentioned that they don't exercise. And then the reason they gave was basically humans are like batteries. We only have so much energy across our whole life. And if you exercise, you lower that. I'm not sure about that one anyway. Yeah, I forget who it was, but
I just went to the funeral of a golf friend, 102.
Wow.
He had a friend who died about a year ago from the same little town in South Carolina, and he was 102.
Okay, where is that?
something in the water.
96, South Carolina.
Oh, yeah, I know about that.
It's famous for having people who live to 102.
He was telling me he had a physical a number of years ago, and the doctor said, now, where are you from? And he said, 96. The doctor said, no, I know how old you are. Where are you from?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a weird name.
Yeah, 96 got its name. It was 96, during the colonial period, it was 96 miles from a trading post or something like that. Yeah. And so they just gave it the name 96.
It is shocking how lazy humans are with naming
Yeah.
things, right? And so, I mean, I this is off topic from that, but I'll transition, all that good stuff. I remember I was reading, I think it was Jason and the Argonauts, one of those classic myths. And I was reading it online, and it was someone, some student who did the translation of it. And he translated the names of the monsters. And it was the first time I realized, right, because all these Greek monsters have these just wild names, right? They don't. One of the monsters' name was Tree Bender. Why? Because he bent a tree, hooked you to it, and let go. Another one was Stone Dropper. Right now, in Greek, they sound wild, but it's just,
Oh, Greek.
that's the big guy with the big club. So we call him the big guy with the big club, right? Humans are just not, we're not very creative, at least if we don't have to be. All right. So I was telling Joe earlier that Epiphany this year has been crazy long. And yet it seems strange to me that next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. So, it's one of those, mysteries of time and all that kind of thing. But I think Einstein has an anecdote about that, relativity and that kind of thing. But anyway, so today we are closing out our study, our look at the early church through various figures of the early church, these church fathers. We're closing out with an interesting individual. His name is John of Damascus. We're closing with him because we're jumping quite a ways forward in history. There's a huge gap. Augustine was 400s. John of Damascus is 700s. So we've made a real leap forward. And it's not to say that there wasn't a bunch of stuff going on in those 300 years. There was. However, of course, the 300s to 500s are definitely the height of the patristic age. That's when everything is happening and going on. But John of Damascus, and the reason we've jumped all the way to him is mostly because he's considered by most to be the last church father. Right? So if you make Ignatius of Antioch the first, just because he's older than Polycarp or something like that, right? Then the last of the church fathers is John of Damascus. As with many things, right, no one upon John of Damascus's death said, and thus the patristic age comes to an end. Now scholasticism, right? That obviously didn't happen. This is kind of looking back. And we'll see a little bit of that. We'll talk a little bit about the transition of the Western church after this age. Because, quite frankly, we are not far from the Great Schism, right? Does anyone know what the Great Schism is? Or does that ring a bell?
Greek Orthodox Church?
So the Greek Orthodox Church is very relevant to this conversation. One of the large accusations leveled against Luther is that they had a name for it, and I can't remember what it is right now. Maybe one of you will get it. But he was guilty of dividing the church, right? Well, that's only true if you ignore the time that the Catholic Church divided the church 500 years before that, right? Right around the year 1000, and it just makes it easy. Just say 1000, close enough. And so another few centuries from where we are here, but around the year 1000, the church splits between East and West. We're going to note that that split is noticeable already in John of Damascus' lifetime. And we're going to talk about that because he gets wrapped up in a controversy that exists because of this divide. You might remember this divide and some of the things that divide East and West, they go back really far. In our second lesson on Irenaeus of Lyon, right? So a guy in the 150s, he was called on to basically adjudicate a discrepancy between the eastern and western halves of the churches about the date of Easter, right? So he was called to kind of sort this out, and he didn't. Everyone kind of just agreed, we'll let you do what you want to do, we'll do what we want to do, but that date of Easter becomes one of the excuses given for why the church was divided. We're going to see some other ones today. So the division between the East and the West is a long time coming, but we're going to start to see that a little bit more today. And it's also part of the reason why we have this shift in eras. John of Damascus, for the most part, is also the last of the Eastern theologians that's widely recognized in the West. Which is interesting, partly, as we'll see, because he was a pretty ardent opponent of Western theology. Yet his contributions were significant enough that he's called, even in the Western church, a doctor of the church. And so that also kind of helps aid with this transitional period out of the patristic age and into what in the Western church becomes the scholastic era. By the way, I've mentioned this a couple times before. When does the scholastic era end? With Martin Luther. He's kind of the guy that kind of ends that, right? Of course, and we'll mention him again later, the most prominent of the scholastics being Thomas Aquinas, which might be a name that you've heard before. But we're not there yet. We're going to talk, like I said, we're going to hit some influences there, but that's not where we are. So today, we're going to talk about John of Damascus. Before we do that, are there any background lingering questions from anything else that we've dealt with in this patristic class? All right, so let's do John of Damascus. He's a fun individual. He's pretty unique among the fathers that we've talked about for a number of reasons. One of them is that his story in many ways begins well before he was born. To really understand John of Damascus, who he is and the situation that was the world when he was kind of doing his thing, we need to go back to his grandfather specifically. Now, a number of you were here for my class on the Muslim conquest that I did for the seniors Bible study. I mentioned John of Damascus in there because of his grandfather. So his grandfather was named Mansur ibn Sarjun. We're getting to those kind of names today, which just means Mansur, son of Sarjun, right? Ibn just means son. It's the Arabic version of Ben, right? Benjamin, son of my right hand, right? Ibn is just son in Arabic, right? Which is why technically the official name of John of Damascus is John ibn Sarjun ibn Mansur ibn Sarjun, and then they stop after that. But no one says that because that's too many words, right? But Mansur ibn Sarjun was a Byzantine tax official during the reign of a very significant emperor, Heraclius, and then his successor, Maurice. both of these guys, especially Heraclius, are extremely important to the flow of history, but not to this class. What you need to know about them, specifically Heraclius, is that Heraclius is a Byzantine emperor. He's kind of one of the first of the emperors that are no longer associated with the Western Roman Empire. So he's considered a Byzantine emperor. And mostly him, a little bit of his son as well, get involved in what is basically a three-way world war, if you will, in what we would consider the Middle East. And there's a fantastic book on this if you want the history side of things. It's called The War of Three Gods, because it was the Byzantines, which are Christians, the Arabs, who are Muslim at this point, right? That is now about 30 years old. It is brand new, but the Muslims are a thing now. And then I forget which emperor, a Persian empire, that's name I can't remember. They were on their way out the door. They were about to collapse anyway. They're not the Parthians anyway. Which practice, anyone know what the Persian religion of this time was? Zoroastrianism, which is one of these really weirdo, obscure religions that still exists today. There are Zoroastrians around, not many of them, but there are some of them around. But the Persians, they more or less collapse just as soon as either Heraclius or the Muslims kind of blow on their cities. They'll just fall down. They are really not doing well. Byzantines are under, like I said, Heraclius and Maurice is when John of Damascus' grandfather was living. They were, at this point that's relevant for us, the Byzantines and the Arabs were largely at war with one another. So we kind of have another massive name that's not going to be relevant after this for this class. But we talked about him a lot in that seniors class. Khalid ibn al-Walid, who is he's the first great conqueror of Islam, right? He is the reason that Islam, right, in the 700s went on a map from this to that. That was Khalid ibn Walid. That was him. The Byzantine Empire will last for a lot longer, right? We got almost another 1,000 years, or we got like another 700 years of Byzantium to go. But at this stage, they are not doing well. They're kind of collapsing under the weight of their own bureaucracy. They're having various factions pushing in on their borders from all directions, especially this kind of surprise heavyweight in the Muslims moving through the territory here. And more or less, they are not able to project their power to the edge of their empire. And what this causes, and this is something that Khalid and the Muslims are able to take tremendous advantage of, because especially early on, and really for a long time, the Muslims, for everything that they were fantastic administrators. They're really good at running things. And so what happens is, as cities fall to the Muslims, and they don't have to fight if they just open the gates, all of a sudden they go from a bloated, overweight bureaucracy where they're basically sending all of their tax money to Constantinople, never seeing it again because of how far out they are, to an incredibly well-administered political organization that really is taking an interest in these cities. And so all of a sudden, you get this wave of cities that kind of more or less say to themselves, these guys know what they're doing. The old guys don't. Life's better with them. And another key factor here, and we're going to see it with John of Damascus, he deals with this directly. He's one of the reasons why we know this, is most people at this time, during this initial push of the Muslim conquest, understood Islam to be a Christian heresy. It's just like the Arians, just like the Nestorians, right? These are just some rulers that have a wrong idea specifically about who Jesus is, and they got some other weird stuff they're going to blow over just like all those other heretics did. that didn't happen, right? They don't have the 2020 hindsight of history that we do. But for the most part, people, especially in what is the Byzantine Empire, they just view the Muslims as Christian heretics at this point. They haven't quite figured out. They don't know what is actually going on and the new religious force that Islam is and will become. And so many administrators in cities throw open the gates, let the Muslims in, or let the Arabs in, as they probably would have understood it, and turned over the keys to the city. This is what John of Damascus' grandfather did. He is the one who opened the gates to specifically Khalid ibn al-Walid, gave him the keys to Damascus, and that is the conquest of Damascus. There's a siege. They don't immediately open the gates. We don't have great records of what went on inside, but there seems to have been a little bit of infighting. There are definitely people who are not happy that John of Damascus' grandfather opened the gates, especially in the decades to come. And so there's factionalism within Damascus that kind of will follow John for the rest of his life. So his grandfather was a Byzantine tax official, is the guy who opened the gates to Khalid, welcoming in the Muslim invaders, if you will, the Muslim conquerors, and made Damascus, right, an Islamic city, which it has more or less remained uninterrupted until this day. You got to kind of forget the Mongols and the Timurids a little bit, but they're their own thing, right? But for the most part, that's when Damascus transfers over to Islamic rule. His father, Sarjun ibn Manzur, served as a governor, or as a government official. We don't know exactly what he was doing, but we think it was widespread financial oversight within the city. He's working inside the Islamic State government as Christian. He doesn't convert. And by the way, the options if the Muslim armies of this time, if they came to your city, to your village, to you had basically three choices. You could fight and die, which is mostly what happened because these guys were really good at what they were doing, which was conquering. You could convert to Islam. That would solve all your problems as far as they were concerned, and that would make you one of them. Full rights, full citizen, the whole 9 yards, which was we talked about this when Constantine converts, right? This becomes a very lucrative thing to do, so a lot of people take that offer up. Or you could surrender and keep your faith, whatever it is, Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian. Later, they will have to pay, I used to know the name of it, what I call the I'm not a Muslim tax. So they just basically have, what was that?
Zakat.
The zakat, thank you. Which is just a fee for not being Muslim. That's all it was. The only other stipulation that was part of the negotiations for Damascus was that the Muslims would not let other religions build new places of worship. They could keep the ones they had, but they couldn't build new ones. So overall, not too bad as far as things would go. So his father still remains a Christian, serves in the government as an official, likely as the financial overseer of the city. Now not serving the Byzantines, as his grandfather did, but what is known to history as the Umayyad Caliphate. That is Umayyad. What we know about his family is a lot of guesses. We don't have great biographical sketches of John of Damascus or his family, but from what we can gather by his name, where they are, these kinds of things, they were likely descended from Syrian/Arab nomadic Christian tribes that at some point settled down in Damascus. This was not an uncommon thing for nomadic peoples to, from time to time or permanently, settle in cities. It seems to be our best guess as to where he comes from. So he's either Syrian, Arab, or probably more likely some combination of the two from a previous nomadic group that goes as far back as he would have known to be Christian as well. He was raised in Damascus. Oh, we don't know exactly when he was born, but we have a 2-year range. So he was born either in the year 675 or 676. So like I said, we don't know exactly when he was born. We can get pretty close. We also don't know when he dies. Well, we think we know when he dies. We have good kind of legends and traditions to go by, but you will find people who have written wildly different age ranges, with some people saying that he lived to be over 100 years old. There is, and it was in a paper that I wrote a paper on John of Damascus in seminary. We know a hard end date for his life, because at one point his body gets exhumed, and we know exactly when that happens. So his body's exhumed, and he's also posthumously declared a heretic for political reasons. And so you can't be posthumously declared anything or exhumed without being dead first. So we know he can't have lived past that point, but we got a good guess. We'll get there by the end of his life. John was raised in Damascus, and as someone who descended from a well-off bureaucratic family, more or less, he was given, quite frankly, one of the broadest educations possible at this time. So we know that he was taught the Greek classics, like many of the other church fathers would have been. So he was kind of educated as any Byzantine bureaucrat, rich individual would have been trained. He was also taught Christian theology under monks in Damascus, even after the Muslim conquest. And he is also given an Islamic education. So he is very familiar with early Islamic teachings. We know basically for sure that he not only read the Quran, but had studied the Quran, although he is not friendly towards it at all, which we'll get to as we go. But John will become a very valuable source, because he's one of the first individuals that discusses and deals with Islam as a religion from outside of Islam. There's plenty of people talking about the Muslims and the Arabs who are, rampaging across the world as a group of people. But as someone who is examining the theology, the doctrine, the teachings, he's one of the earliest that isn't Islamic, right? So we get an outsider's perspective on what they taught, what he believed about them, and that sort of thing. And it can be insightful from a historical perspective in that sense. After his education, it seems that he began his career likely as basically a local tax collector. Again, just entering into that bureaucratic system set up by the Umayyad Caliphate, following the family business, if you will. Other than that, we know basically nothing about his early life. Questions about John, or all of that massive historical context that I'm glossing over, that is the Muslim conquest, the crumbling Byzantine Empire, and all that kind of stuff. All right, cool. Around the year 706, so when he's, what would that be, about 30, he leaves Damascus. Why exactly he leaves Damascus is not certain. Some of the various guesses are, one, some of that family, the hatred towards his family for letting in the Muslims, especially and probably paired alongside of this fact that around this time, the caliphate does start trying to push against Christianity. So they seize churches, they try and shutter doors. There's not like early Roman persecution where they're rounding them up and feeding them to lions, but they are trying to phase Christianity out, and they're starting to get a little heavy-handed, which that might be the reason alone that John leaves. But there's a good chance that right? You have your community of Christians knows that your grandfather let the Muslims in, and now the Muslims are shutting down all the churches. That probably didn't make him very popular. And his father does seem to still be alive at this point as well. So it seems like around the year 706, probably for these sorts of reasons, John of Damascus and his father leave Damascus and travel to a small town monastery outside of Jerusalem. Don't know what happens to his father at that point. There's some legends about him becoming a monk, but we really don't know. We do know that at this time, John of Damascus does become a monk in this monastery. And later in his life, a number of years later, he does become ordained as a priest. Unlike most of the church fathers, he will not be elevated to bishop at any point, right? And there is, as far as I know, there is no bishop of Damascus anymore. There definitely would have been one. I don't believe there is one at this point. So he's of Damascus because that's where he was from. He was also sometimes known as John Damascene, right, of Damascus. It seems that name was used in his lifetime to distinguish him from the 8 million other Johns running around at this time, right? It was then, as it is now, an extremely popular name, and so he was distinguished because of where he came from. While he is serving as a monk, and around the time he becomes a priest, although again, we don't know exactly when most of these things are happening, part of the problem with John of Damascus is that the first biography we have of him is 200 years after his death, which means basically everything in it is hearsay at best. And so it's really hard to, and not only that, but it's also a hagiography, which is a saint biography. We're going to get to a story that's in there that did not happen. Let me just tell you that right now. But it's a really crazy one, so we're going to talk about it. So that makes it even less reliable as a historical thing. So what exactly is going on with him, we don't really know. But during this time, as he is a monk, the first iconoclasm, or first iconoclasm breaks out. So we talked briefly about icons a number of weeks ago because almost every picture, I think Augustine is the only exception to this. Every one of the pictures I've given you for your notes are icons, right? Does anyone remember anything about our conversation on icons? What they are, what's going on with them?
I don't think they worship them, but they use them as a remembrance.
Yeah, so by this time, that is an open question as to whether or not they are worshiping them or not. And more or less, what happens is one side says you are worshiping them, and another side says no, we're not. And that's gonna, right, here's the rift begins. So yes, there's some level of veneration. They see, even today, the view of icons is that they provide a window into heaven. Yeah, good. Anything else that you guys remember about icons? They're these special holy images that, like I said, they give you that portal into heaven, kind of a window for you to see the divine things. And some, especially uneducated people, did start to, as far as we can tell, view the icons as an object of worship rather than a tool for meditation. I talked briefly about how we know that icons were used as baptismal sponsors at one point. We also know that there was incense being burned to the icons at times. But how far and how widespread the outright worship of icons is something of an open question. But it wasn't an open question to Pope Leo III. Let's see, do I have these dates here? No, of course I don't. So Pope Leo III, and he is a pope at this point. We are calling him pope. That is an official thing. Although what it means to be pope is still being developed. I saw a great video. It was a TikTok not too long ago. Is a historian. I love him. He does a great job of like what people think about historical things and then the reality of them. And he does reenactments. It's great. He did one on the Pope recently, and it's how we think medieval and early Christians thought of the Pope as, His Holiness, the Vicar of Christ. He can do no wrong. He's sacrosanct. And the reality is much different, right? There were French kings that sent thugs to beat the Pope up from time to time. There were multiple popes. So what the Pope is and how much authority he has varies wildly depending on where you are in history and who you are talking to. But one of the things that did give the Pope a lot of authority goes back to those 5 primary cities of Christian thought. I've mentioned it before. How many of those 5 are in the Western Church speaking Latin? It's just Rome. And so the Bishop of Rome starts to accumulate. Let's say that the division of power and authority, if you will, is divided equally in the East and the West. Well, it gets split between 4 different patriarchs over in the East and just one guy in the West. So the Pope is able to accumulate an enormous amount of authority in the church. And this is one of these times where that authority kind of goes to the head of the Pope. He hears reports that the people out in the East, the Greek-speaking Christians, are worshiping icons. And he says, that's not good. Don't worship icons, which we agree with. And so what he does is he starts what is known as the Great Iconoclasm. He sends orders out to the East that says, icons, no more. Stop, basically. That doesn't go over well in the East, where icons are a big part of their identity as Christians and their worship and who they are. And so the East pushes back. Pope Leo throws his weight around and a lot of political influences and starts to win the day. He orders icons to be destroyed or whitewashed. And you can see plenty of pictures that will look up like the first iconoclastic controversy. There's more than one. And we still have icons that were whitewashed. And it's kind of wild because it's this icon it would look exactly like this picture, except you take white out and you smush it over the face. That's what they would do. They would basically erase the faces off of these things or other important parts of the icon. And some of them still survive. Other icons were smashed and destroyed. This caused a big, iconoclasm sounds dramatic. Controversy, this caused a big problem in the church. The icons and the iconoclasm, it's called the first for a reason. A future iconoclasm will be another one of these reasons why the church splits. John becomes involved in the iconoclasm as an apologist of icons. In the Eastern Church, this is his big thing. What we remember him for in the Western Church is not this. This is why I said it's really significant, because he writes aggressively against Western theology here and Western theologians. He goes on a defense of the icons. This is one of his major writing endeavors, if you will. One of the famous ways he goes about defending the icons, he is negating this idea that Christians are worshiping the icons. And he explains why that's not what's happening. And he uses this very Psalm 1 approach. He says, well, if you want to be a holy Christian person, you should associate yourself with holy Christian people. And more or less, if you sit in a room with a bunch of pictures of the saints, you're remembering them and you're associating with them so you can become more like them. That's one of his kind of famous movements that he does to defend the icons. And largely it works. In the end, there's lots of hurt feelings around the iconoclasm on all sides, but I think you would have to, if you had to draw a winner, the East wins this one. Because icons persist, and John of Damascus is a big part of why. So when we looked at his legacy across the whole church, his defense of the icons, like I said, is what the Eastern Church remembers him for more than anything else. That is his major contribution to Eastern Orthodoxy. It's less relevant to us in the West because, well, we're We don't agree with a lot of things he says about icons, and a lot of what icons would become later. Question about the iconoclasm before we get to this dramatic story about his life. All right. So during the iconoclasm, John is making a name for himself. He is widely known as being this defender of the icons. Pope Leo goes after him. And the way he does it, as far as we know, this is all true, is Pope Leo more or less forges documents and accusations of like embezzlement, basically, and sends them over to the Umayyad Caliphate, saying, hey, John of Damascus is guilty of all these crimes. He is then arrested, and his right hand is cut off and hung up in the city square as punishment for his crimes. After a few days, as the story goes, after a few days, he goes to the authorities and requests that his hand be returned to him, which is, they give him his hand back. He then takes his hand to an icon of the Theotokos, which the Theotokos is who? One of those fancy words, the God-bearer, Mary, right? Again, going back to that, Theotokos sounds like a fancy name. It's just the one who carried Jesus is basically what it is, right? So he goes to an icon of Mary, prays before it, and his hand is miraculously restored to him. He then has a silver icon of a hand cast, and he adds it to this icon of Mary, which may or may not still exist today. I couldn't quite figure that out. And he was thereafter known as John the Three-Handed, right? Now, we get this story 200 years after his death in a hagiography, right? You need him to have miracles, that kind of thing. And so, did anyone ever call him John the Three-Handed? No idea. Probably not. Maybe they did for an entirely unrelated reason, and that stuck around, and the guy who wrote the hagiography of John of Damascus said, oh, this must be why, or that legend grew, right? So, let's pause, though, for a second. Because we didn't really do this with Polycarp, although we could have, right? Because the fire didn't kill him, if you remember, right? He baked like bread, and then a dove flew out of his chest when they stabbed him with the dagger, right? Weird things. These legends that come up around some of these saints. So let's take a look at John of Damascus and this story in particular, because I think we can draw the line pretty easily here. Why? Why would this story stick around with John of Damascus, right? Completely made up, right? I'm not telling you that I believe that any of this actually happened. I mean, maybe his hand did get cut off. Maybe he had a silver hand added on. Maybe that's why he was called John the Three-Handed, right? Who knows, right? We don't know how much of a shred of truth there is in this. But why would, let's say someone made this story up deliberately. Why would they do it? Specifically this story, not just some story. Why this story? What do you think they're trying to do?
To prove icons are powerful or something?
I think you nailed it, right? I don't know this for sure, but you right? This is historical investigation stuff, right? You ask yourself, well, why is this source doing this, right? And what do we know about John? We know that he's famous for defending the icons and the relevance and the importance and the godliness of icons. And we know, well, I guess you guys don't know this, the guy who wrote his hagiography is also in the Eastern Church. Probably could have guessed that, but he is. From Jerusalem, by the way. I think it's John of Jerusalem, because of course he's named John. And so you have this legendary story of a defender of the icons who sits before an icon and his hand is miraculously restored to him, right? Anyone who hears this story, especially in the early medieval context, there would have been exactly no question about this in the early medieval context. The way the people of that time thought is just fundamentally different than the way you think, right? You have suspicion of most things that you hear because of the scientific world and the information, all that kind of stuff. They didn't, right? In fact, it would have been strange to them if someone as important as John of Damascus didn't have something miraculous about his life, right? And so when they hear this, it's very natural for them to kind of make these connections, right? And it helps lift up not only the person of John of Damascus, but also, more importantly for later generations, the relevance and the efficacy of icons, right? John was blessed by an icon. You can be blessed by an icon too, right? These sorts of things happen constantly, right? I mentioned Polycarp, right? What's the deal? He gets stabbed and a bird flies out of his chest, a dove, and then the blood rushes out and quenches the fire. What might the implications of that be? What do you think this early church hagiographer is trying to do?
He's like Christ.
Yes, and if you go back and read the martyrdom of Polycarp, and if you do, this might be a fun exercise, because I'm going to tell you to go read some stuff when you're done here. Or I'm going to encourage you. That's how I'm ending this class, right? If you do read the martyrdom of Polycarp, just make a little tally mark on a note card, highlight everything that sounds kind of like Jesus and his passion, right? It's a lot. It is a lot, and it's on purpose, right? And so you have, right, the blood and the spirit coming out of Polycarp, and his blood douses the flames of the pagans, right? So that he is not suffering from the eternal fire, right? All the symbolism gets built into it. And this is, like I said, this is a regular occurrence, especially in the first, even up to Luther and beyond, we get some of these kinds of legendary stories that get added in, right? Quite frankly, it's not terribly different. I'd say it's a little bit more highbrow, but it's not terribly different than, right, those local legends and, Bigfoot out in the backyard, right? There's reasons why these things come up and why people are telling these stories and that kind of thing. So we don't learn about John of Damascus through this story, but we learn about his legacy. We learn about what people thought about him and what people thought about icons.
Could they be wanting to elevate the prominency of Mary?
Oh, yes, there's definitely some of that, right? Like I said, I know that there was a very famous icon of the Theotokos that John of Damascus was related to. It got moved at one point from one location to another, right? So that, whatever of this story is real, that's probably one of those shreds of reality to it. But yeah, I mean, we are seeing even now, and even earlier in the church, we are seeing kind of the elevation of Mary. Although what I do want to caution you on here is the elevation of Mary in the Eastern Church goes a different direction, and quite frankly, a better direction than it does in the Western Church. Where nowadays you have fringe groups, and this is not a general Catholic belief, let me just be very clear, but there are fringe groups of Catholics out there that say that Mary is a co-redemptrix, right? So she's part of the redeeming work of Jesus. That's a hard no, right? Even the Catholic, like I said, these are like fringe groups of the Catholic Church nowadays. But that's not the direction this is going. It has more, the role of Mary in the Eastern Church is more about the two natures of Christ. Like with Cyril of Alexandria, recognizing that if Mary is the one who bears God, then Jesus has two natures. Is kind of where it goes directionally. Of course, icons are a whole different story and that kind of thing. So yes, it's definitely an elevation of Mary here too, but not in the sense that we might necessarily think in the Western Church. Good. Any other questions? All right. During his time as a monk and a priest, John would go on to preach sermons and write a whole bunch of other stuff that we're going to talk about in a minute here. Best guess is that he died on December 4th, 749. Part of the reason why we have the day December 4th is that's when he's remembered. And so it's a pretty good guess that that's when he died. We really don't know. And the seven.
I thought you said he didn't know the day of his death.
We don't. This is a guess. This is the most
This
commonly...
is a pretty specific guess.
Well, so we do know that he's remembered on December 4th. So I think when I say that we don't know the date of his death, we're probably more confident that it's December 4th that he died. It's what year it was that we're less confident in. And again, I say he died in 749. That's the common consensus among scholars nowadays, but we really don't know for sure. Like I said, that puts him at 70 something, late 70s, mid 70s. There are legends of him growing to be aging to over 100. Which also, by the way, extremely long life in saints is another one of these kind of legendary things. It's something of a trope, right? It goes back to Polycarp, who is definitely that old, right? But the assumption that God blesses these great saints with long life so that they can influence the church for a long time is pretty common. So him growing to over 100 is not very likely. But we do have people who claim that. Bill, did you have a question? All right, it looks like you did for a second there. All right, so legacy and works are kind of going to do together. I've already said his legacy in the Eastern Church is his defense of icons. He has a number of works defending the icons. You can still purchase them today. They are available. I have not read any of those. However, certainly in the Western Church. The reason the Western Church likes John of Damascus so much and venerates him as a saint and as a doctor of the church is another one of his works, known as the Fountain of Knowledge, or sometimes the Source of Knowledge. This is a massive encyclopedic style. I say massive, it's not that big, but it's the scope is massive. Encyclopedic work in 3 parts. Part 1 is known as Dialectic. This is his philosophical introduction. It's a primer on logic and the way Christian philosophy was operating in his time, mostly so that you can understand the rest of what he's talking about. The second book, or the second portion, is concerning heresy. This originally was 80 chapters long, in which John discusses every heresy of the church. He explains where it came from, gives a brief summary of what the belief is, and he often, not always, but will often provide brief contradictions and arguments against them. I say it began as 80 chapters. He will go on to add on to that later in his life after it starts making rounds, finally ending with 101 chapters, the last 3 of which I believe are on Islam, where he discusses Islam. This is one of those places where we see that John does not say this is a new religion. He says this is a heresy. It's a Christological heresy. They have bad beliefs about Abraham. And it's one other thing that I can't remember that he nails these heretics as he views them on, right? And so he discusses why they believe these things and why they're wrong, right? So one of the things that's relevant here, is a good place to mention it, is that John in this book, The Fountain of Knowledge, writes almost nothing original. This book is almost entirely comprised of quotations. In fact, this is his expressed goal. His goal is to say nothing that comes from his own mind. What he's trying to do, and he does successfully, is he is trying to lay down what the church fathers have taught. And so in this way, what this book becomes is a summary of the patristic age, all in one nice, neat little package. He is kind of dinged because he almost never quotes the Bible. There's almost no biblical quotations in anything that he does. But that's because he's not trying to quote the Bible. Right? He's quoting the fathers. And the idea is, if you like what this says, you go read what that guy said, and trust me, they quoted the Bible a lot, right? The one exception to this, the exception to him quoting, and the exception to him using biblical quotations, is his discussion of Islam. His discussion of Islam makes extensive use of biblical type citations and has no quotations at all, mostly because he's the first church father to talk about this, right? So he doesn't have anyone to quote from, right? And he lays out so many biblical citations here because he's refuting them. This is his against the heresies, but specifically against Islam. It's very brief. You can probably read his whole section concerning Islam in 15, 20 minutes. It is not long. Like I said, when I say it's a massive work, it is massive in scope, not in length. So the first portion is the dialectic, which is the least important of the three. The second is concerning heresies. I have read that one. It reads like an encyclopedia, because it is. It is just a list. Here's Gnosticism part 1. Here's another version of Gnosticism. Here's another version of Gnosticism. Oh, now we're at Arianism. Oh, now we're... And it's just rapid fire. Boom, 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 boom. He just works his way through the whole thing. The whole history of the church as he knows it. I mean, he goes through 101 heresies, right? His third book here is known as is called An Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith. It is a summary of the faith expressed by the church fathers since the time of Christ. Not only have I read this one, I have it. So I'll pass this around if you want to take a look briefly at it. This one, I don't know where I got it. It is definitely not a very well polished. There's misspellings in there and that kind of thing. So I don't know who did the translation here. The trick with John Damascus is it's easier to find his stuff on the icons because the Eastern Orthodox, St. Vladimir Seminary Press, everything the church fathers wrote is basically published by them. They do all this stuff on icons. They don't have this. But we wouldn't agree with everything that's written in there. Some things we think might be phrased strangely. But, and in fact, I would encourage you, if this class has inspired you to read some of the patristic authors, this is not a bad place to start because it is a summary of what all the fathers before him basically thought. He has his favorites. He loves the Cappadocian fathers. His favorite of those is Gregory of Nazianzus. He's quoted more than anyone else in there, but he does quote from a wide variety of church fathers. It does not have footnotes. This is what this guy said. It's not annotated in that way. It's just written out as a block of text. But worth reading, free online if you can do some Googling. One of a great quote that is, there's a number of good quotes from that book, but one of them is this, and it comes from his dialectic portion. Philosophy, again, is love of wisdom. That, by the way, is what the word philosophy means, literally translated, is love of wisdom, but true wisdom is God. Therefore, the love of God, this is the true philosophy, right? This is his worldview, right? Philosophy is wisdom. God is wisdom. Therefore, loving God, loving wisdom, it's the same thing. And so if you want to know the world, you must first know God, that kind of thing. Any questions about this massive work? Massive. He's also known as a hymnographer. He wrote a bunch of hymns and liturgies. His liturgy is still used in the Orthodox tradition to this day. And 2 of his hymns are in the Lutheran service book. So I'll pass this around as well. I have them marked with the colorful ribbons. They're both in our Easter section. The 2 hymns are The Day of Resurrection and Come You Faithful, Raise the Strain. All of you have sung both of them many times if you spent any amount of Easters here at Rivercliff. Come You Faithful, Raise the Strain is one of Angie's favorites, so we can sing that one a lot. And The Day of Resurrection is probably the more famous of his two. A note on the hymn, obviously it's translated. It sounds different to us than it would to him. I think the tunes that we use are from like the 1500s. Honestly, if he was singing them, it probably would have sounded a lot more like, was it the Mugdahar? I think, is that what it's called? No. I remember what the Mugdahar is. Never mind. Anyway, the Mugdahar is a theoretical weapon of mass destruction that Al-Qaeda tried to make. The calls for prayer that go out on the loud sirens every morning. Right, you've all heard these if you watched any movies that take place in the Middle East. Yeah, although I am not even going to try to do it. That's probably what his hymns would have sounded like. The tunes, and that was the style of music. In fact, and I've heard some clips from them, Coptic Christians, if you don't know what is going on, you just have an unlabeled audio recording, you would just assume that they were Muslim worship services, because that's what they sound like. Now, obviously, the things they're saying are extremely different, but the music style is the same. That's kind of that lilting chant sort of thing. But we don't sing that here. We don't sing those tunes here. I can't even attempt to make some of those sounds because I don't know how to do any of them. But so we use Western tunes with the words. By the way, there's a bunch of hymns in our hymnal written by church fathers. And I like pointing them out whenever I get the option. I know Ambrose. Yeah, Ambrose has a great one for Advent. Anyway, but when the hymnal was put together, the idea was to bring Christian music from across all ages, and that includes a lot of the church fathers. And a lot of these guys were writing hymns, right? This is one of the ways they taught people, was by writing hymns. One of the things that is not a rule, but if we ever have a Trinitarian verse in a hymn, go look down in your hymnal and see who wrote it. Because while many authors put Trinitarian stanzas, almost all of the church fathers have them in there. That is something, again, it's not exclusive, but I believe both of, and granted they're Easter hymns, so it's a little bit different, but I think both of the Easter hymns that John of Damascus wrote that we have Trinitarian verses in them, right? These are the ones with the triangles that we all like to stand up for, right? So that's a good sign that this might have been written by one of the church fathers. I should go look. And you will recognize a number of those names now. But, of course, not all of them. Any other questions about John of Damascus?
Why are the Lutherans so involved with him?
Mostly because of the book I passed around. So, oh, good. Yeah, I forgot to talk about scholasticism and all that. So, this work, the exact exposition of the Christian faith is, or the fountain of knowledge, the whole thing, becomes a major touchstone of East and West. Basically, everything he writes in there, everyone agrees with. And so it becomes a place of unity. It spans eras. So we know for a fact that Thomas Aquinas had the fountain of knowledge on his desk when he was writing the Summa Theologica, which is his magnum opus master work and considered the pinnacle of scholasticism. And one of his primary sources that he was using was the fountain of knowledge to make that touchstone. It's because of that work that he's remembered in the West, and how significant that work in particular is for us and for knowledge of what the church fathers are saying and how to apply it. Scholasticism, you can also see the roots of scholasticism here. So not only is John of Damascus considered the last church father, some people also call him the first scholastic. We talked about the most famous of the scholastic authors. It's Thomas Aquinas. Probably the second most famous is Peter Lombard. He's a Western, scholasticism is a Western thing, primarily. Peter Lombard, shortly after this time, will write a book called Lombard's Sentences. And it's a very It's an extraordinarily impactful work. What Lombard does is he takes the Bible and he kind of shrinks it down and he writes commentary in the margins, both exegetical and theological. And then he teaches from that book. And so what his students do is the same thing. They shrink down the text and they write notes in the margins of what, and basically that's why we have so many copies of Lombard sentences. They were just transcribing it in their classes. And then what happens in the next generation, right? Peter Lombard's dead. His students go to teach. They have Lombard sentences in front of them, but they shrunk it down. And in the margins, they wrote their own notes, lecture notes, and they teach that. This is a really effective way of teaching. However, if you keep doing this over time, you get a situation where the Bible is only about this big, and all you're reading or all you're thinking about is the stuff in the margins. This is the theological world that Luther enters into, right? Is way down the pipe on this. So it often comes up, like, how did the theologians of the Reformation have so little biblical literacy, right? Like they just don't read the Bible. They don't know what's in the Bible, right? I mean, they do a little bit here and there. They know what's in the lectionary. Luther actually remarks at how shocked he was when he found out how big the Bible was. Because as far as he knew, he knew it was bigger than the weekly readings. He didn't think it was that much bigger. And then he encounters a real Bible that's not Lombard sentences 20 times removed. And he's shocked at how much there is. And then he reads through and goes, oh, God isn't super mad at me all the time, right? God is merciful. That had been lost in these generations of teachings, right? That just build off one after another, right? It's like woodworking, Bill, right? You have your stick, and it's the length you need it to be. It's perfect. And you need to make 80 more, right? And so what you do is you measure. You use that one, you butt it up against the saw, and you run the saw down, right? And then what do? What's the important next step? Which one do you keep and which one do you put in the pile?
The original.
You keep the first one and you put the other one in the pile. Why don't you just keep going like that? Moving them one after the other after the other.
Never gets bigger.
By the time you're done with your 26, the first one's this long and the last one's this long. And you go, well, hold on, how'd that happen, right? Because those small errors add up, right? Oh, yeah, absolutely. They just accumulate and they build and they multiply, right? This is happening over hundreds of years where, one guy said something about how God hates sin. And 100 years later, it's God hates you, right? That's kind of what happened. That is not to say that the scholastic period is like this dark ages of theology. A lot of really important stuff happens during the scholastic age. The Summa Theologica that Aquinas writes is still a masterpiece. It's like the pinnacle of Catholic theology, but Lutherans like it too. We had some problems with it, but we use it as well. I didn't take any of them, but a few of my classmates took classes where they had to buy certain volumes of the Summa Theologica to work through, right? What happens with Luther, and one of the things that kind of helps Luther get out of this mess, is you have the rise of something called humanism. This is a broader philosophical movement in Europe. And a number of the things that humanism did in relationship to theology is there was a push to get back to the source, right? And so you have guys, all these people we debate that are big names that are really, anyway, this is a class in the Fathers, not on the Reformation era. But you have all these humanists that start retranslating the Bible, right? That look at the Vulgate and kind of say, well, we need to get back from before the Vulgate, right? Let's read that. Let's not read through Lombard's sentences, right? Let's read the actual Bible. Oh, you also have rediscovery is too strong, but a heightened interest in the classics, right? The Crusades have something to do with this, right? They brought back the Crusaders brought a lot of books back with them. Among them were all these books that European intellectuals had never seen before. Things like everything Aristotle and Plato wrote. Most of the Greek philosophers came back with the Crusaders, and a lot of early church theology comes back with the Crusaders because they weren't copying them down. Dark Ages, by the way, is going out of style, but early medieval chaos has a lot to do with that. Who was keeping all of these things alive? Joe, who was keeping all these books around?
Monks, yeah.
Oh, so there were some monks, but it was mostly the Muslims, right? This is another one of these the Muslim scientific revolution happens right around the time of the Crusades. It's the Muslim Islamic Golden Age. They're the ones that keep all of these things. And then that's why the Crusaders are the ones that bring them back, right? Because what did the Crusaders just get finished doing? It's killing all the people that had these really extensive libraries, grabbing all the books, and then they took them home, gave them to people who could read them, because they're in foreign languages, not because everyone who went on crusades is illiterate. And then all these theologians and monks and philosophers and intellectuals go, oh my God, we forgot some stuff, guys. And then humanism. And so the church fathers make a resurgence, right? They don't disappear, but they make a resurgence just before the Reformation, which is another reason why so many of the Reformation fathers talk a lot, quote a lot from the church fathers, from these guys that we've been talking about, from Augustine in particular, right, as we discussed last week. It's because of this move to, right, let's get back to the original. Let's read the Bible. But let's also read what the first people who read the Bible were thinking. Not what someone more recent that didn't read the Bible who read it from someone else, right? So it's kind of like, let's go back to the beginning of this game of telephone and see what these guys were saying, right? By the way, that's one of the reasons why the Apostolic Fathers are my favorite, right? Because you get a little look into history and you get to read what the first people who read the Bible thought about, right? The first people who were converted to Christianity after the Bible, right? And the events of Acts and all of that, what they thought. And it's not shaded, if you will, by everything else that's happened in the world. You get back to the origins, right? And like we said early in this class, they don't get everything right. They mess things up. It's easier for us to see where they screw things up. And they give us insights that we don't always get through other means. That's one of the reasons why I love the church fathers so much, why we're spending time talking about these guys and all of that.
I wonder how much of this Luther looked at and said they all got it wrong.
Not as much as you would think.
He could quote when they got it right, and he could quote when they got it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that became important, right? There were, I've mentioned this before, there's a whole section in the Book of Concord that is just quotes from the church fathers because they're agreeing with us. It's called the Catalog of Testimonies. And it's, because this was a problem, right? And the church fathers became a solution to both sides of this problem, right? So you have Luther and let's just say Eck, because John Eck was one of his theological opponents, right? And they're both saying we got it right. We're both reading the Bible because John Eck is a humanist as well. So Luther and John Eck are both influenced by humanism, early humanism. Later humanism goes weird directions and you get, like, atheism eventually comes out of humanism too, like modern atheism. This is way before all that. So Eck and Luther are both influenced by humanism. They're both going back to the source, right? They're both reading the same Bible and they come up with different answers, right? As one of my professors once said, apparently they did this to someone who wrote a dissertation, or probably not a dissertation, probably, essay for a master's or something like that. Said, this all looks right. Who agrees with you? Because if no one agrees with you, I don't care, right? You need to find someone else who agrees with you. And so when Luther and Eck are arguing, again, this is the Lutherans and the Catholics, are arguing about these things, and they can't just win each other over, right? They're at an impasse there. Both of them say, well, who else can we get to weigh in on this? And they say, Well, we got all these church fathers. Let's see what they had to say. Let's see who, if we drag John of Damascus, just because he was today, out of the 8th century, crammed him in the 16th, and said, who's right about this? Who's he going to side with? And how do you do that? Well, you look through what they wrote. And so both sides, I would say Lutherans do it better, have extensive quotations and analysis of what the church fathers are saying to say, hey, look, these guys agree with me, right? This is a huge aspect of like the overall Lutheran argument of the Reformation, which is not, we are, right, one of the major Lutheran arguments is we are not leaving the church. We are not breaking the church. We are not forming a new church. The Catholic Church is the one that has done that. We are getting back to what the church has always been, right? There's a great quote by Will Wheaton. He was interviewed. It's a great interview. It's on YouTube. It's 2 parts because Will Wheaton won't stop talking in the best way ever. You knew him. You were in circuit with him. I really like Will Wheaton, by the way. Not the actor on Star Trek. He's fine too. But this is one of our Lutheran LCMS theologians. He at the end of one of these interviews on the YouTube channel, it used to be the 10-minute Bible hour. I think it's just the Bible hour now because he realized most of his videos were like an hour long. Anyway, not a Lutheran guy. That's not important. One of these videos ends with Will Wheaton saying, we are the one true holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, not the Catholics. And the interviewer basically goes, that's a pretty bold statement. He goes, I know, and it's true. If I had to say there's one person who knows the church fathers more than anyone else on this planet, it's Will Wheaton. That man is an encyclopedia. And maybe Joel Olowski. 2 of them would have to duke it out. I don't know who would win that one. Anyway, it's worthwhile to go check out that interview. It's a guy defending the LCMS, or showing the LCMS to the world is what he's doing, basically. But yeah, that's the argument that Lutherans make, is that, just for the purposes of this class, if the church fathers were teleported to today, they'd be LCMS Lutherans. That's our argument, right? And quite frankly, there's a little bit of this of, if you don't think that about your church body, you shouldn't be in that church body, right? If you think, oh, well, if we transported the fathers to today, they would definitely be Baptist, then you should probably really consider becoming a Baptist. Because you have 500 years of some of the most intelligent people, or 500 to 700 years, the most intelligent people who agree with someone who's not you, by and large. Not saying, right, doesn't mean that they're not all-knowing and inerrant, but you should probably really consider where you stand, right? And so that's one of these major Lutheran, even LCMS arguments, is kind of the sense of, if you teleported the church fathers to today, they'd be members of our church body because they agree with us more than anything else. That's our general understanding. Do you have a question? Oh man, you were looking at me with you looked like Bill.
Well, they'd certainly be more comfortable in our worship service than in a Methodist or Baptist.
Well, yeah, yes. We could sing their hymns too, right? Savior of the Nations Come. That's Ambrose's hymn. That one's probably in the contemporary circles too, with guitars and all that. Anyway, but yes, but for what it's worth, a lot of them, the music that we play would have been utterly foreign to all of these guys. But the liturgies would have been more recognizable. We got a lot of stuff that they were writing and they were doing in their worship, and that's intentional. That is not an accident. That is something that we did on purpose to connect with the church at large. I got one more book to pass around. This is one of my favorite commentaries. This is the one on Luke. If you know the name, it was written by Arthur J. Just, who did the LCMS Blue commentary on Luke as well. This is the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. you've probably heard that name, one of my professors, Joel Olowski. He's one of the main editors of the whole series. Apparently he had an argument once with Just, because Luke is 1 volume. Just thought it should be 2, because he had a lot to say and a lot to write. And so he went to Olowski and said, I need 2 volumes. Olowski apparently said, no, you get 1. And Just said, you get 2, because Olowski was doing the one on John, and John has 2 volumes. He said, well, you get 2 volumes, why don't I? And he said, I'm the editor, and moved on. So what this does, and I put a bookmark in there to last week's gospel reading. That's there's also other bookmarks of other things that I had marked. This is one of my go-tos when I don't know what to preach. I just go in there and I see if there's anything that stands out to me. It is a compilation of a huge amount, basically all of the church fathers condensed down into their comments on various Bible pericopes or readings. It obviously doesn't encompass everything they say, and it's just quotations from the books. But occasionally I have gone and found the book that the thing was written in and read portions of it as well. But this, if you're curious and you want to look at it, will give you kind of a little bit of an insight into kind of how these writings go in little bite-sized chunks. That is 1 volume. I don't have the whole set, but I got many of them on my shelves. This is, like I said, this is one of my favorite commentaries. This is one of the commentaries that gets my money. The other one is the Concordia commentary series and the People's Bible commentary. Between those 3, you never need to buy another commentary. A lot of money in commentaries, but you'll never need to buy another commentary between those 3. So I hope you've enjoyed our kind of rocket ship ride through the early church. I think, fascinating time that it is. You got to see kind of the human side of the early church and how these individuals that we talked about are like, generally they're motivated by a deep care for the people that are around them and their faith and their well-being, what they believe, and their salvation, these sorts of things. That's what motivated these individuals more than anything else, is bringing God to the people around them. And they do a fantastic job of doing that. If you are so inspired to read anything by the church fathers, I highly encourage it. I'm going to give you my personal recommendations just from what we've gone through. If you like encyclopedia, Wikipedia articles, that's the one for you. Exact exposition of or the Orthodox faith gives you a good overview of the whole thing, right? If you want something from the Apostolic Fathers, anything by them is good. If you're particularly interested in the sermon that I preached last Sunday, I would encourage you to read Ignatius's letters, because nothing I said was intentionally connected to his letters, but a lot of things he said in his letters were in the back of my mind. The main reason why I didn't quote him at all last week is because I quoted Ignatius like 3 weeks ago, and I was like, I can't bring him up twice that quickly. So Ignatius's letters or the martyrdom of Polycarp, neither of them will take you very long to get through. I think the greatest work of all the church fathers, and one of the most accessible, is On the Incarnation by Athanasius. It's phenomenal. You'd think it's a Christmas book, but it's more of an Easter book. And he lays out in it not only just good doctrine and belief of Christ, but he brings you into the story of salvation. And he is very concerned in that work with this idea of, why does Jesus do anything that he does? It's to save you. And on the other side of that same coin, everything Jesus does is to save you. Here's why. And he kind of works his way through a lot of those sorts of things, right?
At one time, CPH published the Greek text.
So if you want to read it in Greek, if you're Joe.
And if you're looking for an edition of it to read, be sure to find the one with the introduction by C.S.
Yes.
Lewis.
Just reading
It's the introduction.
Part of me doesn't want to recommend that you read C.S. Lewis's introduction. Would you know why? This is one of these teacher things. Because then a number of the clever things that I have to say, you'll find out are just that introduction. So you're going to peek behind, right? It's just a man behind the curtain sort of thing. No, it is. This is overstating it, but the introduction to On the Incarnation that C.S. Lewis writes is one of the most insightful and impactful things that C.S. Lewis wrote. Which is saying a lot. It's an introduction to a book with a man that wrote as much as C.S. Lewis did. And he wrote a lot of really good, really influential stuff. But his introduction to On the Incarnation is, I think, that impactful. It's not as meaningful as Screwtape Letters or some of his other things. But it's up in the running for some of the best bit of writing he ever did. I would start there. And when you read them and fall in love with them, then we can go to some of the more obscure stuff on my little shelf of patristics. If you do want to start buying some of these books, the Popular Patristics series by St. Vladimir Seminary Press is an excellent source. They're reasonably priced with very understandable translations. Whenever I am looking to purchase something from the early church and the church fathers, I don't even go on Amazon. I go to St. Vladimir Seminary Press first. Because if they have it, that's the one I'm getting. They are just, like I said, best bang for your buck and readability. Because while the fathers themselves almost always wrote in a very readable and understandable, down-to-earth way, translations into English are not always that. Because they're, unfortunately, I mean no offense, they're written by Greek scholars. And the Greek scholars, unlike this one over here, can often be extraordinarily dry. And Lewis kind of gets into that a little bit in his introduction, that scholars are much worse than the originals. Yeah, any other questions about church fathers?
This is an observation.
Yeah.
I may be wrong, but
I make them all the time.
One thing that strikes me is the early church fathers didn't do anything spectacular.
No.
I'm comparing it to Luther. You said, what did Luther do? And everybody said, bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
And the early church fathers, they did their research and they made their arguments.
Mm-hmm.
It got written down and then it was passed along. But you ask the average Joe Blow, what do you remember about John?
Right, or who is that, right? Yeah, meanwhile, we could say, before this class, could any of you name something that was written by the church fathers in general? I bet you have it memorized. Or some version of that. It's the Nicene Creed. We say it every other week in church. That would not exist without these guys that we've been talking about, right? So I think you're right. And granted, sometimes really dramatic stuff does happen with them, but in large part, they were just pastors doing their pastor thing, and they were passionate about Jesus. And their influence is not as front of mind as guys like Luther or Calvin or a lot of these more recognizable names. But the church would not be what it is today without them.
Is that partly because the church fathers did not have a printing press or something like that?
That they're not as well known?
Yeah, is that part of it?
No, I don't think so. What would you... Because the works we have are well distributed. So that's not it. I don't know, Joe, how would you...
There were a lot of other fathers who were writing, and we don't know of them, but we don't have anything that they wrote.
And that's because of the printing press. Yeah.
The ones that we have were treasured by the church. Some of them were included in manuscripts of the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They were considered so precious. you turn that book of Revelation, and then you find, in fact, in some texts, you wouldn't find the book of Revelation. You'd find First Clement and Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache.
I think one of the reasons why the church fathers are not as well known as the Reformation fathers, let's say, part of it's a recency bias, right? How many of you can name 2 battles in the Napoleonic Wars? Waterloo's, that's why I said 2. There's another massively important one, except it was on water, not on land.
Moscow.
Okay, that's a good one, right? But do you know that's because of that statistic model. Anyway, Trafalgar is a huge one, right? Yeah. How many of you can name 2 battles in World War II?
Oh yeah.
Right? So make it harder, right? Give me 20 to name, right? Easy.
Yeah.
Why? Well, World War II happened more recently. It's a more direct impact on the world we live in today, although the Napoleonic Wars are just as influential as World War II. Just World War II happened more recently, right? And so this always happens, right? It's fun. There's also this great, and I think it's worth mentioning just because we do it all the time, and it happens when we read the Bible too. It's this historical idea of telescoping, which is, right? When we talk about the 20th century, how do we divide it? By decade, right? But when we talk about, the Middle Ages, how do we divide that? Oh, if you're lucky, you get just a century, right? We have early, middle, and late, right? It's like 1,000 years, and we put it in 3 chunks, right? And this is an extremely natural thing to do, right? Do you think there weren't as many influential and impactful things in every decade of the Middle Ages? Well, some recency biases, well, no, of course not, right? And things accelerate with technology, like I get that. But go back, go and listen or read, detailed histories that people are doing, and you're going to find out. There's a podcast, I got through a chunk of it, but it was too German for me. It's the history of the Germans, written by a German, and it is in English, which is good. But he starts the podcast off by saying where he's starting in history. He's like, I could start with the Romans, but I am an old man, and I'd like to get this at least somewhat along before I die, right? That dude, he's going through the 700, around this time actually, and he's doing it he'll have an hour and a half on a year. And you go, well, that was, a whole dynasty. It's like, no, that was 1 year of one dude's reign, right? You can do it for all that, but it was forever ago, and it doesn't directly impact us. So I think that happens with the church fathers, to one extent.
Translation is another issue.
Translations are an issue.
We're Western Christians,
right?
And as a result, these guys who mainly wrote Greek, except for Tertullian.
Right, and some of the Western fathers.
The West wasn't reading them that much.
Like I said, a lot of them were lost in the West, and that's the tradition we come from. Also, one thing I will say is, at least this is my perception, so maybe it's the opposite of the telescoping thing, but I think patristics are making something of a comeback. They have in the past 50 years or so. Part of it is with discoveries and more translations and more desire to read them, but the amount of people that I have run into that know what I'm talking about when I mention some of these individuals, and they know more than I do about a lot of them. Just not other pastors, just random people on the street, is a lot more than I would have guessed, right? So I would say it's probably not quite as overshadowed as you might think it is, but it definitely, the Reformation, especially for Luther, just overshadows it. It's way more directly influential on who we are than people writing 1,000 years before it, right? Doesn't mean that it wouldn't have happened without those guys, right? But when I got here, I'll throw her name under the bus. Pastor Jordan pointed me over to Judy Lagerbloom because we're both book people. And we were talking and I said, she asked me, this is like weeks after I got here, right? She said, well, what kind of stuff do you like? I said, I like the really old stuff. And she says, I do too. I can't get enough of Bonhoeffer and C.S. Lewis. And I laughed. I audibly laughed, and she'll tell you the same story. I audibly laughed and said, no, Judy, those are infants. Those are mere babies. So I'm talking about the old stuff. She says, like Luther and Chemnitz. I said, no, toddlers. And she kind of looks at me funny, and I walked her into my office. I handed her the early Christian writings. I said, these guys were writing in the year 100. And she went, she's read most of my patristic shelf at this point. I think I got Judy kind of hooked on this a little bit, right? But yeah, there's something to be said about just, well, that's the other thing, right? I read a Christian book that's 2,000 years old, right? It's pretty cool, other than the Bible, right? Yes, Bill.
I think you said we don't know who wrote the Athanasian Creed.
Right.
But what period of time?
In fact, I think I've done the research on this recently. If memory serves, it's actually around the time of John of Damascus. It's in the rough 700s. Yeah, is when we think it comes.
So what groups were arguing about the Trinity?
I know our guess is that the Athanasian Creed comes out of Africa, so it might be as a reaction to Islam. I don't know. I'm making guesses.
Associated with Africa and Spain.
Okay, yeah.
And probably Islam was the big issue that they were trying to address. And the attempt is, let's recover the theology of Athanasius.
Right, which is why the name is.
Yeah, he didn't write it, but it's to recapture his theology based on what they were facing with Islam going across northern Africa and into Spain.
And one of the realities that's worth grappling with here, and this is often the case, is we here in this class have done a very compartmentalized, sanitized version of all this. Insofar as, I've said things like Athanasius then put the nail in the coffin of Arianism, it's basically done. That word basically does some heavy lifting there. It doesn't actually go away, it just kind of goes, it's just minimized, right? And so, right, it's just like, we've talked about this. Jehovah's Witnesses are basically Arians. They're a little bit different, but the fundamental theology is the same. And so all of these heresies pop up here and there, sometimes local, sometimes broad. So would we say things like, Nicaea nailed down that Jesus and the Son and the Father are of the same substance. Even that sentence is just not true, right? That is where we have the Orthodox faith established, but when everyone walked out of Nicaea, that was not something everyone agreed to. They thought about that for a long time. And there are still holdouts today, I'm sure, not Jehovah's Witnesses specifically, that don't like that, right? And things pop up here and there. So to say, the church had settled the issue of the Trinity in the 500s or whatever, that's largely true. Doesn't mean it's entirely true, right? So something happens, another group pops up, and okay, got to deal with this again. Here's how we do it. We'll close with this. It's a defense of why the church fathers and tradition in this sense are important. I forget who told me the story. It was one of my professors, not any of the guys we talked about here. Said he was at a conference as a speaker, and so it wasn't a Lutheran conference, it was some non-denom group thing. And he was sitting at lunch with guys who were having a heated argument. Not an argument, heated discussion. And he kind of asked them what it was about. And what he uncovered was in this larger group, there was a controversy about whether or not the Holy Spirit is God. And they were trying to sort out how to defend the deity of the Holy Spirit, right? And apparently he kind of just laughed a little bit and he said, just read the creed. We did this before, right? And so when you lose it and you kind of say, no creed but Christ, well, okay, it's a good it comes from a good place, but now we've lost all these years of people doing really important work, right? And then all of a sudden heresies pop back up again because someone gets a wrong idea, just like it did the first time, right? Someone got a wrong idea and then ran with it and didn't get corrected. So, well, we're 5 minutes over, and I told Joe that we'd be done early today. So, I mean, that's just how it is. Yeah, he didn't believe me, but anyway. So let's close with the Lord's Prayer. And if you guys want to talk more about this, obviously, I'm very excited to do so. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, thank you all. I will see you all next Wednesday, as I put ashes on your forehead.